This is the webcast for Chapter 12, Unraveling of the Medieval Synthesis for your Philosophy 1030 class. So we're going to start off talking about some of what John Duns Scotus has to say and then follow it up with William of Ockham. That's what I'd like for you to get out of this chapter. We're not going to cover every little detail. We're just going to hit on some of the main points here as we go along. So, as far as the medieval era goes, this is towards the end of it before you get to the Renaissance and the Enlightenment period in Europe. So during this time period, you've got a heavy decline in the power of the church. The church rested on this idea that there was a hierarchy of power. If you recall Aquinas' great chain of being, there was an authority that was involved in that, where the church was the closest of the people to God, and they had a lot of their authority that came to them from that special position. But as states decided and levied for their own power and to diminish the influence that the church had on those individual states, you saw a decline in the church authority and also in the unity that the church had enjoyed. So at the end of the medieval era, you have these independent states like France and England and Germany, etc., all vying for more independence from the church and to get away from the influence that the papacy had enjoyed for a very long time. One of the interesting side effects of that is that in Europe during that time period, although you have a decline in the power of the church and the rise of some individual states, you also have a lot of infighting as the church's authority declines and those states are able to pursue their own interests without having to worry about what the church is necessarily going to say or do about it. So those pillars of medieval society started to crumble. This chipped away at some of the scholastic thinkers, or the thinkers who were learned people that studied scripture and were learned people within the church disciplines. They were people of sincere faith who were trying to use reason to study the subjects that were available to them in the medieval era, including philosophy. The thoughts in the time period stayed pretty firm on the omnipotence of God. The position of God in society remained pretty strong. But during the end of the medieval period, you can see where God's actions start to seem just as free as they were, but maybe even perhaps more so when you look at the thinking of someone like John Duns Scotus, and he advocates more than anybody perhaps the idea that what God does is beyond our ability to analyze, explain, or reason anything about it. So here's our figure, John Duns Scotus, and he says that the Trinity cannot be proven by reason. Now, this whole question of the Trinity is present in medieval thought. If you think back to universals and particulars, the idea that universals and particulars even matter is based in the debate over how you can explain the Holy Trinity between Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost. Without universals, it's hard to explain how those three particulars of Father, Son, and Holy Ghost can be the same thing. But if you have a universal form, like a form of God, then you can see how those three things, although they're different particulars, can be the same thing as a universal. John Duns Scotus says, look, we've been arguing about this for a long time. We've been talking about universals and particulars. We've got Plato and Augustine on one hand. We've got Aristotle, and we have Thomas Aquinas on the other hand. But maybe it's just the case that we can't have any real concrete thought that is provable, that is satisfactory, etc., on what the Trinity is. Maybe it's just beyond our capacity to reason about. So too might that be true with things like proofs for God's existence. Maybe it's only a matter of faith that's at issue here. Real proofs for God's existence, although you might give them. Someone like Thomas Aquinas has 5, Augustine has others, and when you look at those proofs for God's existence, and you wonder why there are so many, maybe, John Duns Scotus says, it's because that you can't really prove God's existence, that it would always be a matter of faith. So more so than anybody else, John Duns Scotus puts strong limits on reason. For him, philosophy is very theoretical, too theoretical. Theology is the most practical thing for him, because theology will help get you through life, but philosophy will only lead you to uncertainty and spinning your wheels, at least according to John Duns Scotus. I tend to disagree with him, but I'm a philosopher, so. His idea on universals here. He says only individuals are real, but universals do have some kind of objective reality. Only individuals are real, so the desk is real, the chair is real, the computer monitor in front of you is real. But universals have some kind of objective reality, so you might not be able to perceive a universal, but they do have some kind of reality to them. There's something real about them. They do exist in some way, but they don't exist in the same way as these objects around us that we can perceive with our senses. This is problematic, though, because he says you can only come to have knowledge, you can only know things, and those things are forms. To have knowledge of an individual, then you have to have knowledge of their form, or know their form. And this is where you get the idea of hasitis, individuating differences. So this idea of individuating differences is one that you've probably picked up on as a little bit of a sub-thread throughout medieval thinking by now, but it's this idea that, say, for example, if you look at humanity, there's a form of humanity that exists, but for each individual thing, there's a form of Socrates, you, one of me, and a form for everything else that individuates it and makes it different. If you just had universal forms and then you had the particulars, and you didn't have forms that existed in those particular things also, then you would recognize each of those individual things, according to John Duns, as just part of that form, but you'd have a hard time really knowing those individual things very well. You'd have a hard time having knowledge of them. Only by them having their own separate forms that are participating in the larger forms do you really get much knowledge about those particular things. So it's, in a way, it's a synthesizing of Platonic and Aristotelian ideas. John Duns on natural theology. You can see where this is a progression of medieval thought, because he looks at Augustine and he looks at Aquinas' proofs for the existence of God, and especially the ones of Thomas Aquinas. He looks and doesn't think that you can find any certainty in those proofs. They might give you a probability of whether or not God exists, but they can't give you any real certainty. It can't put the matter to rest for you, because there's nothing in it that you can really know. Probability is the most that you can muster, and certainty for that is based on faith alone. So when you look at the theology of John Duns Scotus, and we look at, say, for example, what his picture might look like, if you look at the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas, you have a Venn diagram that looks like this, where here's natural theology, here in the middle, here's reason, here's faith. John Duns Scotus is like this. Here's faith, and here's reason. They're two separate things. Truths that are knowable by faith cannot be known by reason, and truths knowable by reason cannot be known by faith, but there's no overlap between them. There's a very concrete line between the two. Our certainty of what we know is only going to be based on faith alone, and reason can give you probability, but nothing else. So he does give faith an upper hand, so to speak, in the relationship between faith and reason. But interestingly enough, although he sees faith as the higher truths, this separation of faith and reason really paves the way for reason, even though it's probabilistic, to be freed up entirely from matters of faith and worrying about matters of faith. people who were worried about that sort of thinking called John Donne, John Donne's and his followers duncemen. And that's where you get the term dunce, or somebody who, if you remember the old term, sits in a corner with a cone on their head. That's where that idea comes from. It's a derogatory term to refer to John Donne and his followers. So what then does he say about moral philosophy and the primacy of the will? He agrees that the will is superior to the intellect. Knowledge is just an instrument of the will. So there's some Augustinian ideas. The will can't be influenced or determined by the intellect at all, and there's no way to learn truths by natural means, only by God's command. This idea that truths can only be learned by God's command is a rejection of Aquinas' view that you might be able to come across some truths by reason and natural theology. He says it's only God's command. So even morality, or trying to figure out what the right thing to do is, would only come to you via God's command. Let's move on to William of Ockham. John Duns Scotus, as a thinker, gives us some interesting ideas, but when you look at, say, for example, how influential John Duns was as opposed to Aquinas or Augustine, he is a bit of a synthesizer, but his ideas are not taken as seriously, and it's just useful to look at him to see the end of the progression of that kind of medieval thought in theology from the early to mid-church period. William of Ockham is perhaps more influential than John Duns Scotus was. William of Ockham was about simplicity overall. What we remember William of Ockham for was this idea of Occam's razor. So you see there was the razor at the bottom of the screen. If you missed it, there it is. There it goes. Occam's razor. So it's about a way of thinking that's going to guide empiricists, meaning people who think that you can get knowledge through the senses. It guides them in the future and influences our modern scientific method. So if you think about how science proceeds today with a hypothesis and then a testing of that hypothesis and then an adjusting of the hypothesis and then more testing and then trying to take those views and see if you can replicate them before you decide, yes, this seems like it's a viable scientific piece of knowledge and the science has been done correctly, etc. His razor, so to speak, is seen as one of the early parts to scientific method that comes to us from antiquity. So he says plurality is not to be assumed without necessity. Do not multiply entities beyond necessity. And he gets this idea a bit from Aristotle. Aristotle, remember in the discussion with Plato about universal forms and particulars, Plato says that there's a whole world of forms and that the objects in this world participate in the forms, and that's how we can know the individual things in this world. But the individual things in this world, by participating in the world of forms, he's created a whole nother realm to explain this one. He has a whole nother world he's multiplied. He has a plurality of worlds that he needs to assume in order to explain this one, but he's doing so, it seems, without necessity. It's unclear that you have to do that. In fact, Aristotle says, what if you just have the forms in the things themselves? Isn't that enough to explain how the forms can exist and help to give us knowledge of individual particular things without having to assume a whole nother realm? So it seems like that's a clear case of trying to multiply entities beyond necessity. He's favoring the simple over the complicated overall, and when you look at something like modern science or modern physics is attempting to have a grand unified theory of everything, and the idea is that it'll be as simple as having, say, a formula that's as long as this sentence here, rather than something that would fill up a whole chalkboard to try and explain how the universe works and the relationships between things. Just like Einstein's theory of relativity to explain mass and the speed of light and that interaction, his theory of relativity is just this simple. E equals mc squared, right? That's a really simple formula to explain how everything moves and how speed is relative to the movement of another object. So examples of Occam's razor. If we look at this particular example and we ask ourselves a question, how does a watch work? Well, here's a typical watch, and there may be two competing views on how a watch works. On one hand, we might have fairies, where you've just got these little pixies with their wings, and they sprinkle some pixie dust all over the watch here, and that's what keeps it ticking and allows it to keep on going. Or maybe we can just say we have batteries, like an Energizer battery, and that's what keeps the watch going. Which one does Occam's razor support? It's going to be the little bunny there, right? It's going to be the bunny. The bunny does it, of course. No, just kidding. It's the batteries. So how about this one? Mom's not home. If we look at the question of which one is more simplistic, where did Mom go? Was she abducted by aliens like E.T. and the old E.T. Phone Home movie by Steven Spielberg? Or did she just go to the store? The more simplistic and likely option here is going to be Mom went to the store. She was not, in fact, abducted by aliens, no matter how interesting they might look. A lot of people thought that by using Occam's razor that he was trying to do away with the Trinity. But really what William of Ockham was trying to do, instead of, say, using Occam's razor to say, look, this nonsense about universals in particular seems to be unnecessary metaphysics. Why do we need universals and universal forms to explain particular things? Maybe it's just particular things. Or if the universals exist, perhaps maybe in the things themselves. We don't need all those extra unnecessary metaphysics. By having those unnecessary metaphysics, in some ways, we're setting limits on what God's true power would be. Because the only way we can understand those things then is if it's just the way that we say it is. But couldn't God have done whatever he would want to in trying to create the world? It seems like we're setting limitations on his power then. By asserting that one metaphysical theory or another is true. Could be in any of those ways. In fact, he was hoping that his strengths would strengthen theology by preventing metaphysical ideas. And in fact, he does for a very long time. Metaphysics, after William of Ockham, does not enjoy a renaissance for hundreds of years before people start to take metaphysics very seriously again. He thought reality could be entirely explained without any appeal to universals whatsoever. And that kind of thinking is really influential in the development of modern science, because nowhere in modern science do you hear very often an appeal to universals. It's only in more eccentric kinds of thinking, like what is a concept and what do concepts mean and what are ideas and do ideas really exist. Those are really, strictly speaking, philosophical questions now, but science, in its empiricism, tends to focus just on the individual particulars, and then if they're looking for things that they have in common, you're looking at a categorization of those things into things like genus, species, phylums, or categories of objects, but you're no longer talking about those forms, etc. So there's a big divergence in the way that thinking works there. So where does knowledge begin for William of Ockham? It only makes sense then that knowledge begins in experience. It doesn't begin by perceiving some forms. There isn't some kind of innate knowledge in your mind. The only trustworthy knowledge available to us begins in experience, and that's intuitive knowledge which we get through our senses. He calls it intuitive knowledge. The name in particular of it is not as important as understanding that it comes through the senses. So he's very much an empiricist. In fact, he says that's the only trustworthy knowledge. Now think of the amount of divergence that is between what William of Ockham is advocating and, say, what thinkers who came before were advocating, like Thomas Aquinas, who said that the highest knowledge could only come through faith, or St. Augustine, who said that knowledge and reason have to be in the service of faith, or you would never come to any amount of truth at all. This is actually the opposite. The only trustworthy knowledge available to man was intuitive knowledge acquired through the senses. All other knowledge then is abstractive knowledge. It's what he calls, and this is a little bit funny, but it might help you to remember it, a pale residue left in the mind by our original experiences, sort of like a memory. So if you come to have knowledge of something like, say, let's see, something that comes through your senses like what the snowfall was like 2 weeks ago whenever it was a blanket of sleet all over the ground. Well, if I ask you about that in a couple of more weeks, you'll have some recollection of what that was like, but it's going to fade some, right? You're not going to have the same amount of knowledge of it. In fact, you're only going to be able to abstract out some of the more general things about it. So he calls abstractive knowledge any kind of knowledge that's not related to an object of immediate experience. It's not related to an object of immediate experience because, of course, time has passed since you were pulling that experience in using your sense data. Now, here he includes in this abstract ideas, which you may have experienced in the past, but those abstract ideas as part of your experiences are often gained from experience, and then that abstract idea is remembered later as that pale residue left in the mind. But that makes the idea about that object even more abstract, right? Another abstract idea might be something like, if I ask you what a person is like or what humanity is like, you're going to have to give me some real generalizations because you're trying to cover everybody, right? You're not going to be able to tell me knowledge of direct, immediate experience like when someone's standing in front of you and you can easily describe them to me. You're going to have ideas about categories of concrete particulars, right? What humanity is, what men are like, what women are like, dogs, cats, mammals, not a specific cat like my cat Cassie, or a specific dog like my dog Cujo. You can't then gain knowledge of universals through the senses because there's nothing to sense. You're not going to gain any knowledge of those. You can abstract and theorize about universals by looking at these particulars and perceiving them, and then abstracting knowledge from them to try and gain knowledge about what is a generalization about those. What is a more universal property of people from observing 100 people and then seeing what everybody has in common. But you're not really gaining knowledge of those universals through the senses. So his nominalism, or his idea about signs here, he says there's two kinds of signs, and this is how we come to understand and know the world, right? He says there's natural signs and conventional signs. A natural sign occurs just when an object signifies its cause. So smoke is going to signify fire. When an object creates a mental picture, like if I say, oh, imagine a tennis ball. Boom, a yellow ball with a curved line that runs through it pops up into your mind, right? An object will signify its cause there. The image is going to be the same for everybody who has similar experience. So I can, with confidence, say tennis ball and know that you have a yellow tennis ball with a curved line that goes through it, because if you've seen a tennis ball, they're pretty standard. Everybody has similar experience of what a tennis ball is like. But if I talk about a natural sign and I say, let me think of something here, and I say green, and I see normal color, and you see and you see in black and white because you're colorblind, then, well, although colorblind people don't just see in black and white, that would be monochromatic. But you get the idea, they wouldn't see the same color as me because there's a difference in how they're made up. And so their images wouldn't be the same, right? They would see a different natural sign there. Conventional signs are much different. When each culture invents words to refer to these mental images. Conventional signs are things like language. If I say that bread covered in sauce, sprinkled with cheese is pizza, and another place says that that is goobly gosh, they're both right. It's just a matter of convention what word refers to that mental image, right? We've just agreed on what to call that by a matter of convention. In fact, different languages have different names for different things just because it's only a matter of convention what those things are called. You could use any word. In fact, that's part of the reason why languages adopt words from other languages if that word seems better. Or that's how we can come up with things like linguistic innovations, a convention of language for somebody who's very new to playing a video game. Well, the language could already take care of that, right? We would say somebody who's new to playing a video game is just someone who has not played this game before. They have not logged a significant amount of time in it. But, in order to be brief and also accurate, we conventionally came up with another name for that type of person who's new to a game, and we just say, oh, there's a noob. He also says nothing else but those signs is needed to explain human thinking. All of human thinking is explainable by looking at the natural and conventional signs. You don't need universals in things themselves, or even an added realm of universals altogether. There just aren't any. You don't need them. It's an unnecessary metaphysic. You can get all of human thought by just thinking about signs and how those signs correspond to experience. This is really influential because this way of thinking is picked up by empiricists all the way up through to the present day. We think about particulars and we use mental signs to think about them. But those mental signs are just signs that we agree with. They're not necessarily universals that we're perceiving. It's just that by means of convention, for ease and functionality, we have agreed on those signs over the years to mean the same thing. There's nothing special about it other than it's a kind of cultural phenomenon. So for him, the only true reality is the concrete individual, which is way separate from thinkers who came before him who would say knowledge comes from the forms, and it's only through the forms that you are able to have knowledge. Ironically, in talking about the role of reason in this way, and concrete individuals being the only true reality, you can see where although he's trying to remove limits to God's choice, and remove limits to God's power, he also provides for an explanation of the world that doesn't necessarily need God. Because if you look at Augustine, and you look at Aquinas, or you look at John Duns Scotus, universals all play a role in that they are associated with divinity. But they play no role in Ockham's. Divinity is more separate from the world in that while God might create the world, it's not necessary for us to have a connection in order to understand the world. We're not perceiving anything in particular or special about God by observing the world. He does agree that everything in the world is contingent, but all we really experience when we're looking around the world and noting that things are contingent is cause and effect. One thing comes from another thing. If it's contingent, then there's no contradiction if we suppose that God could perform a miracle that breaks normal causality, because the new action, the new effect, would stem from the effect of God's intervention, right? So God still has a place in the world and can act upon the world for Ockham. So it's not that he's removing or intentionally removing God from the world altogether. God is still active and can have a way of acting upon it. But if you look at our idea of causality, all we really experience is a regularity. If I throw a ball up into the air, you're going to say, well, what goes up must come down, that ball is going to fall. But something else could happen, right? It could get taken by a really strong gust of wind and thrown far off course to where I never see it fall. Or if I'm doing this outside in the rain, hit by lightning and the ball never falls to the ground, right? That's a breaking of my normal experience. I could assume that something different had happened. Well, I can do more than assume that something different had happened, right? Something different has actually happened. So that's breaking up the regularity of causality, but what he's getting at here is that causality is really about probability, but that could be broken at any time. And one of the ways in which that is broken is when he says God would perform a miracle and break normal causality. So a miracle for William of Ockham is breaking causal chains that are really probable, that things seem to follow all the time, like the laws of physics or the laws of nature. Those seem to hold all the time and without exception, unless, of course, there was a miracle involved. So that's how he explains being able to come to having knowledge about the world by observing concrete particulars, how we can come to understand that and have a common language about it, why it seems like universals and forms are likely to exist, even though we don't need them to explain the world around us, and in so proving that we don't need them argues against the idea that they actually do exist using Occam's razor. And then still nicely having a way to leave room for how God can act on the world around us. We mentioned before that part of what he inadvertently does is cause a big decline in metaphysics. You don't need metaphysics anymore because all knowledge comes from experience for him. This idea that all of knowledge comes from experience is perhaps what you could call a naive kind of empiricism. Whereas this is a big leap forward from medieval thinking, in some ways it's too far. You need the pendulum to swing a little bit back to the middle, because we now know that modern science requires us to have knowledge that doesn't come from experience. Like if I look at an atom, I can see through a complex like electron microscope protons and neutrons and electrons, but if I don't use that microscope, I have no way of perceiving those things. And I'm just using an instrument to give me its observation of that. I'm observing it through a second hand, right? Second-hand knowledge of that thing. Second-hand perceptions of what it is I'm looking at. That's not direct experience. That's not your experience at all when you're looking through that electron microscope. If we look at many phenomena in astrophysics, we can see where actually it's quite possible to have knowledge of what's going on, say, out in space without directly experiencing what that is like. We can look at what we can observe through light, but maybe that is 600,000 light years away. And so we have to judge by what we can see, and then what else we know about the universe to calculate whether or not that star even still exists in our present time, or whether or not there's only 600,000 more years of light that's going to come to us from that star before it explodes, etc. That's not direct experience, but that is a kind of knowledge that we could have. So you do have a revival of things like metaphysics in the current day, but during William of Ockham's time, he actually causes a decline in metaphysics for several hundred years. You're probably not surprised at this point to hear that he rejects natural theology outright. You can never have a direct experience of God, a direct experience of revelation, or a direct experience of anything that happens in faith. So the kind of knowledge that is certain and reliable for us, intuitive knowledge, is impossible. You can't have any of that kind of knowledge of God. You can know God only through faith and revelation. Ockham sees this really as faith-affirming, as somebody who himself is pious. Knowing God through faith and revelation means that what he's saying is your reasoning is always going to be inadequate to try and come to know God and have certainty of the kind of truths that matter. So similar to John Duns Scotus, you have this separation of faith and reason, and God and higher truths are only knowable through faith and revelation, despite how liberating he is for the use of reason in general. It won't get you to those other kinds of truths. He weighs in, just like Augustine and Aquinas do, on ideas of free will. He says that's what makes us moral agents. You cannot have moral responsibility without free will. This is a really influential kind of argument in ethical theory, because if you're not free to choose what your actions are, how can you be held responsible for them? If someone is coercing you to doing something like robbing a bank, but they do that by strapping a bunch of bombs to your body and then saying, if you don't rob this bank, I'm going to make you explode, then you're not really doing that of your own free will. You don't really have choice there. If you're not free at all to do anything, then you can't be held responsible for it. And he sees that that is an essential part of morality. He also says there's no unchangeable natural law because everything in the world is contingent. So the natural laws could change. God is free to do that if he so chose, because everything in the world is entirely contingent upon what happens before it. That's one of the ways in which he allows room for something like miracles to occur, etc. God then is not bound by natural law either. If he was, then natural laws couldn't change, and there might be things in the world that were not contingent. But he sees that that would be a limitation on God's power. He wants God's power to be limitless, and so he's arguing that God could do anything that's actually possible that doesn't involve a contradiction. So maybe something that wouldn't be possible for God to do would be to create a rock that was so heavy he could not lift it. Well, for William of Ockham, that's just not something that God's going to do because it involves a contradiction. An all-powerful being couldn't create something that was so heavy they couldn't lift it. It doesn't make sense. It's a paradoxical statement, and it's maybe interesting to think about, but it involves a kind of contradiction, according to William of Ockham, that makes it such that it's just not something within the realm of possibility. God wouldn't do it. It's no limitation on his power. It's just not a possible thing. He then says we are dependent upon revelation for ethical conclusions, for that is the only way we can know what God willed. So you need revelation and the Bible to come to your ethical conclusions, because you cannot find any of those truths available through faith via reason. Remember, he rejects natural theology, so you must depend upon revelation to find out what it is that God willed. And God could will anything, right? There's a radical voluntarism here where free will makes us moral agents, but the most free will is the will of God. And God's will could be to will anything. So the only way for us to come to actual real ethical conclusions about what is right and what we should be doing is to refer to Revelation and see what it is that God may have willed. If you need to go back, feel free to rewind. I know that's pretty quick. Um, but that's chapter 12 in a nutshell. Remember to study as you go through break, and best of luck on your midterms.